years, been very involved in the Young Gas process, written books on cannabis regulation, worked in Uruguay on their kind of stuff. So I've been itching to get involved all afternoon. So I'm probably going to struggle to be a good chair here and probably just be shooting off my mouth throughout the whole thing. And I'm also obviously completely biased in favour of drug law reform, so I'm not in any way an objective chair. Just want to make that completely clear. Cards on the table, I'm hideously biased. So I'm going to introduce our three brilliant speakers. First up is Kelly from Students for Sensible Drug Policy, a fantastic UK-based organisation. Well, you can tell them about it.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. I'm part of SSDP UK, and we got the opportunity to go to the Young Gas to represent the youth. As you can see, the slogan for this year was "A Better Tomorrow for the World's Youth." It's a bit of progress from what we had before, a drug-free world. I wanted to talk a little bit about the impacts of the drug trade, drug policies and drugs on youth, and just kind of remind people the different impacts that young people have around the world. So in Central and South America, children and young people are incarcerated with their mothers. The criminal justice system in some countries is just as harsh on first-time offenders, including young adults and children. We're all pretty familiar with mass incarceration in the US, and a lot of these people incarcerated are young people. I think it's about 2/3 of young people are in some kind of criminal justice institution, and a lot of them are in there for low-level drug offences. In Colombia and Mexico, obviously, we know that young people are involved in war on drugs. They're killed, they're kidnapped, they're displaced. This is young girls in FARC and the famous 43 students who disappeared or were kidnapped. From 1980 to 2010, Brazil's homicide rate for people aged under 19 grew by 346% to 13.8 per 100,000, almost 3 times the growth in the murder rate for the wider population. And to put this into context, a lot of these young people were involved in the drug trade, which obviously caused their death. This was at the Drug Policy Museum in New York. It's a picture of girls in Iran. They're waiting to be executed. They can't be executed until they're 18, and a lot of them are waiting to be convicted. And they've obviously been convicted for drug offences. In Europe, we've seen small increases in overdose deaths among younger groups in some countries. The data doesn't specify what groups, what countries, but there's seems to be a sort of general trend. And there's zero tolerance approaches in educational settings, something that we've looked at in Newcastle University specifically. We've had lots of stories and experiences of young people who have had disciplinary procedures put on them because of possessions of drugs or illicit substances. And it's a policy that we've managed to change at Newcastle University, and something that we're trying to do in other universities as well. And obviously the rates of stop and search for young people. So some of these issues were discussed at the Young Gas. Generally they were kind of broadly touched on. There was a roundtable on cross-cutting issues which included youth. And the main kind of points were the promotion and protection of children's rights, in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is specifically on under 18-year-olds, so it doesn't specifically discuss young people maybe between the age of 18 and over. And there was a lot about prevention, which obviously is important, but it's not the whole story. Another thing that was raised was the scientific literature that has gaps in what's effective preventive drug use and substance abuse in children and youth, particularly at risk, and when also kind of the gaps in literature around what's effective and safe treatment. And there were two sort of side events that were focused on youth. Unfortunately, we weren't able to access them. I don't know the reasons why. We did have passes, but we snuck into them instead. And so this was a side event, and we took a picture of it for evidence as well because they wouldn't let us in. Eventually we did sneak in, and of everyone there was one young person speaking. Everyone else was probably over 35. Not that that's not young. Not that that's not young. Representative. The issue obviously with this was that listening to a lot of what they were saying, it was really focused on prevention. There was nothing about harm reduction. There was not really a lot around why people or why young people use drugs and the different reasons, experiences that people have. And also it's called listening to the needs of children and youth, and no one was listening there. There was a lot of talk, I guess. Some young people did try to raise some points and their own opinions, but there wasn't a lot of listening. And this was their campaign, so it's I think led by the government of Sweden. Something more positive was the reference in the outcome document to youth. There was, I think, 3 main points, and 2 of them were mainly around prevention again, but kind of a new thing and a really important thing was this point here about needing to address the involvement, use and exploitation in the illicit cultivation of crops, production, manufacturing of and trafficking in narcotic drugs, psychotropic substances and other forms of drug-related crime, including urban crime, youth and gang-related violence and crime, fulfilling the obligations as state parties to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and taking into account the United Nations guidelines for the prevention of juvenile delinquency, which is something that for a while had been talked about, but I think it was mentioned in the 2009 Political Declaration and Plan of Action on drugs, but it wasn't sort of in these more recent kind of documents. And another thing that I was going to mention was that the Civil Society Task Force is obviously a great initiative, but the youth representative, again, although he was representing a youth organisation, he wasn't necessarily young, so hopefully we can have a younger person on the panel. This was the Global Youth Coalition consultation that we had with other youth counterparts, and we were talking about sort of a consensus and the aims that we wanted as a global youth movement, and acknowledging harm reduction, again, an evaluation of the international drug policies with regard to children and young people, complying with UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and actually today we just got confirmation from the Council of Europe that Yoda, Youth Rise, and I think ourselves are going to be doing some research around this, so that's something to look forward to. Again, it's just points that we've talked about today, decriminalisation, investing in research, and further encouraging the UN to work with young people. So as an organisation, we're going to continue to engage with our youth counterparts and continue to make drug policy accessible to young people and students, and hopefully establishing a relationship with the UK government as well. Off the back of the Global Youth Coalition paper, we made our own UK youth position paper, which has been endorsed by Input, and we're hopefully going to be getting some more endorsement for that. So just some recommendations. We definitely need to include and listen to young people and have more young people on panels and to have them as part of consultations. Broaden our engagement with other youth around the world. I think that there was a lot of countries such as the Canadian youth, the Australian youth, the New Zealand youth, so it was all kind of high-income countries. There wasn't a lot of representation of lower income countries or middle income countries in terms of youth, and we also need to broaden our engagement with those outside the field, definitely in non-academic spaces, because I feel like this isn't accessible for a lot of people, or a lot of people that really kind of are interested, or young people, for example, can't access these spaces. And yeah, it would be great to be supported, to call for sensible policies that protect youth. And I also think we should change the slogan and have best tomorrow with the world's youth. So if you want to get involved, please just email us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Our next speaker is Anne Fordham, who is the Executive Director of the International Drug Policy Consortium. She's also has been known as the Queen of UNGAS. But since UNGAS is now over, she's either been, I don't know, abdicated or stateless. Or, anyway, she's no longer the Queen of UNGAS because there isn't UNGAS anymore. But she's probably the world authority of NGO UNGAS stuff. And I think we're going to try and show a video at some point. Does it have sound? Yes. Okay, cool. Technology. Anne Fordham.
Hi everyone, sorry. Okay, what's that? Yes. The sound. I'll play it in a little while. Hi. Thanks, Steve, for the introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak here today. I guess you guys have been here all afternoon. I'm going to try and pep you up, get you all excited about drug policy. Just to say a little bit about IDPC, the International Drug Policy Consortium. I'm the Executive Director. We're a global network of about 150 NGOs from over 60 countries around the world. We come together to promote objective and open debate on drug policy. Our mandate is sort of twofold. It's firstly to ensure that the voices of civil society, organisations and representatives are heard in policy-making forums, whether that's at the national level, the regional level, or in a forum at the international level like the UN. But in addition to that, our second sort of part of the mandate is to seek to influence these debates and provide policy analysis and advice direct to policymakers themselves. And as you probably guessed, we aren't neutral. We do have an agenda, and as a network, we seek to promote reform of drug policies so that they're grounded in the wider objectives of the UN. So principles of human rights, public health, human security, and development. And as a network, and myself personally, we are working towards the UNGAS for 3 years, 3.5 years from when it was announced in 2012, and we followed the debates very closely. So I'm going to sort of just talk a little bit about, I'm going to help my presentation around the hopes or the asks, we call them asks, that IDPC as a global network had for the young gas. And then I'll also talk a little bit about the young gas itself and show you this video, which I think for us illustrates nicely what happened at the meeting itself in New York. Some of you may have already seen it. If you haven't, I hope it's short, it's 3 minutes. And I'm not sure to what extent you've already discussed the young gas today in earlier discussions, but this will really be from the perspective of the network, from the IDPC network. So when the young gas was announced, from our perspective, there was genuinely high hopes because there was a real sense of urgency expressed by the 3 Latin American governments who called for the young gas, so Colombia, Mexico, and Guatemala. I'm just going to quote briefly from the Mexican statement at the General Assembly in 2012 when they called for the young gas. The Mexican delegate said, "Revising the approach on drugs maintained so far by the international community can no longer be postponed. And the UN needs to exercise leadership to conduct an in-depth review, analysing all available options, including regulatory or market measures, in order to establish a new paradigm that would impede the flow of resources to organised crime groups. An international meeting had to be convened that was capable of taking the decisions necessary to increase the effectiveness of the strategies and instruments with which the global community addresses the challenges of drugs and their consequences." So from that quote, you can see that we had good reason to be optimistic, that there was a real sort of the political will to really address this issue was there. Also in the lead up to the UNGAS, there were unprecedented numbers of countries that were starting to express some displeasure with the international drug control system, and also we've seen some genuine reforms take place on the ground through referendum like in the US around cannabis, and I'm sure you discussed that earlier, and also the example of Uruguay creating a state regulated market for recreational cannabis use. And also the shift in the US position is quite important when it came to the UNGAS. So you'll probably be aware that traditionally the US was the global enforcer of this very sort of punitive war on drugs approach. But we've seen that the US has moved much more strongly towards a language of public health. They've also moved, Obama has moved to address disproportionate sentences for drug offences at the federal level. And he's actually this year, or actually in the last 12 months, begun a process to commute the sentences of around 6,000 federal drug offenders. And also a task force that he set up has recommended the repeal of federal mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders. So that's really important in terms of the geopolitics of drug policy, where the US sits within that. In addition, I think the public dissent around drug policy and punitive drug policy approaches has also been shifting. So this was sort of the backdrop to the UNGAS itself, and there was a genuine hope that it would not simply be a reaffirmation of the status quo, but that governments would, in the words of Ban Ki-moon, conduct a wide-ranging open debate that considered all the options. So how have we fared? So IDPC basically came together as a network, as a broad civil society network, and put together 5 key asks that we basically put to member states in terms of the UNGAS process. The first one, ensure an open and inclusive debate. 2, reset the objectives of drug control policies. 3, support policy experimentation and innovation. By that we really meant support the idea that we may need to explore the legal regulation of substances. 4, and this was really a red line for the network, end the criminalisation of the most affected populations, so people who use drugs, and also farmers involved in the subsistence cultivation of crops destined for the illicit drug market. And number 5, commit to the harm reduction approach. So I'll just briefly touch on these asks in terms of how they fared, and I'm going backwards from the last one. So commit to a harm reduction approach. We saw the UNGAS as an opportunity for governments to really commit to reorientating the international drug control system towards public health. And the harm reduction response towards the use of drugs is sort of central to this shift in the approach. But the issue of harm reduction continues to be contentious within the UN debates. And although we felt that it was time that it was openly acknowledged at the UNGAS, both as a concept, but also as a set of interventions. So for people who inject drugs, specifically talking about access to needle and syringe programs, or opiate substitution therapy for people who are dependent on opiates like heroin. And that this concept should be a pillar within its, as its own right, and not that harm reduction should just be a subset under demand reduction. And also, if the UNGAS is an opportunity to examine what's worked and what has not worked within current drug control policies, by every metric set within the system, harm reduction has worked and should be acknowledged as having done so. So that was our sort of advocacy around harm reduction. But despite a strong precedent for mentioning the phrase specifically harm reduction within the UNGAS outcome document, it didn't happen. And Russia in particular was very strongly objected to the words harm reduction and explicit support for this, even though within the HIV/AIDS outcome documents of the General Assembly, harm reduction was acknowledged as far back as 2001. Ending the criminalisation of the most affected populations. Unfortunately, this didn't make it through. There was some progress around addressing proportionality of drug offences, particularly for low-level non-violent drug crimes, and that's been a real push from Latin America, where some countries have looked at their levels of incarceration, particularly for low-level non-violent drug crimes, and seen that this has not worked, incarcerating these people in terms of reducing the scale of the drug market. But we push for an explicit mention of removing criminal sanctions for people who use drugs. We felt that would be a possibility. The US government actually in their submission to the UNGAS outcome document made reference to not punishing people for using drugs. And we saw that as an opportunity. But unfortunately, many governments couldn't even get behind the US wording, and in particular the European Union was very disappointing on that regard. The European Union really couldn't support the idea of removing criminal sanctions for people who use drugs. So it was very disappointing. Supporting policy experimentation and innovation. I mean, here, in addition to saying they should support innovation, such as the idea of considering legal regulation as an option, we also wanted governments to acknowledge that current policies aren't working, that acknowledge the lack of progress that has been achieved by current strongly punitive drug policies, and also acknowledge the collateral damage. And the fact that we have goals that in the Political Declaration and Action Plan on Drugs, which the target of which is 2019, to significantly reduce or eradicate the global drug market. And we wanted an acknowledgement from governments at the UN that we are no closer to those goals. But the UNGAS outcome document does not contain that admission in any way, shape or form. Reset the objectives of drug control policies. Under this ask, we called for the UNGAS to move away, and this relates to the goal, to move away from the damaging goal of a drug-free world, and to set new metrics and indicators to measure how drug control policies contribute to the broader UN objectives that I mentioned of public health, human rights, peace, human security. Unfortunately, the UNGAS outcome document reaffirms the commitment to achieve a society free of drug abuse. And there were calls from some governments for some new indicators on how to measure the success of drug control policies, but they didn't survive the negotiations, which was a shame. And finally, to ensure an open and inclusive debate. And on this point, I will say that I really feel that the UNGAS process, and I'll show you this video very shortly, didn't live up to this commitment. And although even in the proceedings, apart from the quote from Ban Ki-moon, many governments did say they wanted an open, inclusive and honest debate. There were many progressive submissions, both from governments and from UN agencies and from civil society organisations towards the UNGAS outcome that sought to influence the negotiations, many of which talked about a need to move away from repressive approaches. But these submissions were not adequately reflected at all in the UNGAS outcome document, which was negotiated by consensus. So it ends up being somewhat of the lowest common denominator, and also we find in these negotiations of drug policy that the more repressive countries operate as a bloc. So we're talking about China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, Egypt, South Africa. They're very well coordinated. And then the more progressive countries, they don't operate as well in terms of being a bloc. And that's very unfortunate for us who are seeking progressive policies. I personally witnessed a very severe falling out with the two main proponents from Latin America who called for the UNGAS, which was Colombia and Mexico. And at some point, their strategies started to diverge, which was detrimental for real progress in the UNGAS outcome, because they were not aligned on strategy and on many points of the negotiation. So, and you know, in terms of civil society engagement, in the process itself, I think that there were many wins for civil society. We had a consultation overseen by the President of the General Assembly, which is unprecedented in drug control, so that was great. We had a civil society task force that did global consultations that tried to feed into the process. We're getting very progressive messages coming out of those consultations. But as Kelly alluded to in her presentation, at the UNGAS itself in New York, it was appalling. And we felt there was a deliberate attempt to exclude civil society from even observing some of the debates and the negotiations, which is a slightly worrying trend at the UN in New York. But I'm just going to show you this video and then say 1 or 2 minutes afterwards, because this is, I think, really captures what happened at the UNGAS itself and why we felt somewhat heartened. So, you know, the UNGAS outcome document, really disappointing for the most part, but what happened in New York itself was very interesting.
Some countries are legalizing cannabis production, while others are executing people for using or selling cannabis. How can the UN pretend there is a consensus on how to tackle the drug problem?
It's a broad consensus. It's a broad consensus. No,
It certainly is.
It is 2016, and it is time to recognize
risk and harm reduction measures to protect our society.
We have therefore not seen the need to go down the route of harm reduction.
Harm reduction, the success is obvious.
We are concerned over sexual behavior and practice, and we are against it.
It's a broad consensus.
Syringe service programs have been proven effective at saving lives.
We are making naloxone antidote kits available to save lives from overdoses.
I have the honor to take the floor on behalf of the European Union and its member states and the following countries: Andorra, Argentina, Australia.
We would like to put on record the following delegation principal positions: China, Indonesia,
Bosnia and Herzegovina, Canada,
Singapore, Malaysia,
Iceland,
Pakistan,
Liechtenstein, Mexico,
Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates,
Monaco,
Oman,
Montenegro,
Bahrain,
Namibia,
Brunei Darussalam,
New Zealand,
Iran,
Norway,
Egypt.
Uruguay, and Uzbekistan.
The death penalty is an important component of our system of justice.
We have a strong, unequivocal opposition to the death penalty.
There is no international consensus on the abolition of the death penalty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Decriminalizing the use of drugs is a retreat.
The United Kingdom delivers proportionality in criminal justice while retaining a criminal offence for drug possession.
We also introduced the decriminalization of drug possession.
We have decriminalized the consumption. The Republic of Ecuador decriminalizes the use and consumption.
Actually, I am the first chair of this committee to openly support decriminalization.
We remain firm and resolute in our opposition to all calls to legalize controlled drugs.
Any form of legalization of narcotics should be resolutely opposed.
No coherent public health policy can include making yet more substances even more available.
Responsible regulation is the key to reducing drug-related harm.
Uruguay has strategic thinking on the need to regulate all markets.
We must move beyond
prohibition to effective prevention and effective regulation. Thousands of lives depend on this.
Muchas gracias a mi amigo Yuri Fedotov. Support, don't punish. Thank you very much.
Because there was no way that I could describe it as well as that video shows you. But all of those clips are taken from the UNGAS in New York, and myself and colleagues in this room, we sat there and we literally watched governments just disagree with each other, one after the other, even though they had produced their beautiful consensus document that is the outcome document. And for us, I think that's one of the take-home messages. It's really important for those of us pushing for reform and saying to governments, it is time for change. It's time that you do no longer allow yourself to be held hostage by this false consensus. It's time to talk about what's gone wrong, what needs to change. Allow experimentation, or even genuine moves towards different ways to control drugs in our society. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, abusing your royal prerogative there for going on far too long. But it was very interesting. Next is finally Robin Pollard from the Child Rights International Network.
Hello everyone. I'm going to be very brief because it's 7:30. We've been here for 5.5 hours. We've had some very good presentations. I wanted to talk a little bit looking forward. So what kind of strategies can we look at going forward? Mainly focused around the human rights mechanisms, and actually how the UNGAS really kind of was an important milestone for some child rights organisations. It gave us some impetus to coalesce and move forward, which maybe didn't exist before. So that's briefly what I'll talk about. My name is Robin, and Child Rights International, we work on a very broad range of child rights issues. And we tend to focus on more neglected or emerging child rights issues. So we were actually one of the first to talk about drug policy many years ago. And we received considerable pushback from many other child rights organisations who focused on child protection, and they're very opposed to a more universal view of children as right holders, and they should be seen as rights holders, and that's kind of our underlying philosophy. So I think the landscape has changed for us in a number of ways. I think the language around drug policy reform has become a lot more accepted. You can now talk about regulation, decriminalisation, especially decriminalisation for children, which 5-6 years ago people wouldn't go near. And I think also we've seen a lot of the treaty body mechanisms and human rights mechanisms become more accepting of this issue and more willing to discuss it in Geneva and New York. Maybe less so in Vienna, but that's another story. And I think part of our objective needs to move the discussion away from Vienna and the delegations in Vienna to Geneva and maybe in New York if some of the delegations there are receptive to a more progressive approach. Yeah, so for those who come from a human rights background, most of the UN human rights bodies are based in Geneva. So you have a lot of the human rights committees, you have a lot of the country delegations who have human rights staff members will be based there. Whereas Vienna, you have the Atomic Energy Agency and you have the CND. So you have where a lot of states will send, I guess, people from the Ministry of Interior or Home Office, and they tend to be a little bit more status quo. They're not so open to change. they're not really experts in human rights and this kind of thing. So I think, yeah, as Steve asked me to explore on, I think part of our mission should be to kind of move the debate away from the chamber in Vienna and to Geneva. And I think one of the main opportunities I want to speak about, which has come out of the UNGAS process at us and a number of our child rights partners are going to explore in the coming years, is the upcoming global study on children deprived of liberty. This may not be very common knowledge, so I'll briefly describe it. So these global studies are a kind of major undertaking. There's only been two in previous years. There's one in 2006 on violence against children, and one in 1996 on children and armed conflict. And these are studies that are mandated by the General Assembly. They can take 3 to 5 years to undertake. In every country around the world, every region, every country is expected to play a role and answer questions and provide information and data. And the idea is that they present for the first time a detailed picture of a certain issue. So this study will address children deprived of liberty. And I think part of our mission will be to ensure that an aspect of their mandate will be children who are incarcerated for drug offences or incarcerated with their parents who have a drug offence, drug conviction, or children in drug detention centres, or any form of deprivation of liberty, which is very common around the world. So this is going to be one of our main strategies, and we think it will be a really powerful mechanism going forward, which can be used to push states and can be used to feed into the 2019 process, which maybe Steve can talk a bit more about afterwards, as he may be a bit more averse to that information. So the global study is one opportunity. I think secondly, I think as a field, human rights field and a drug policy field, we need to make far better use of some of the treaty body and human rights mechanisms that are based in Geneva. Now, some of our experience has shown that they're more willing to engage the issue in recent years, and especially, for example, the Committee on the Rights of the Child or some of the other kind of committees of the different treaty bodies. They're just not receiving information from civil society or states. So I think leading up to 2019, we made a much more concerted effort to provide alternative reports about how states are violating various aspects of human rights in their drug policies, so whether it can be Mexico or the UK in their stop and search, or it can be anything, but they can't do anything if they don't receive the information. And this is constantly what they're telling us, is that they're not receiving information, so they can't question states on various aspects of rights violations. So this would be something that we're looking forward to as well, as an opportunity to move the discussion away from Vienna. But I think also there's more general opportunities for us coming up, which maybe people haven't yet explored. I know the election of the new Secretary General is taking place in a couple of months. The process is already underway. And I know one of the candidates, I think she was the former head of UNDP, was quite open to a more progressive approach to drug policy reform. I know UNDP is generally seen as not too bad on drug policy issues. So if we could have better leadership from the very top of the UN, it could be an amazing opportunity, and that's something actually we should maybe be more vocal in pursuing. And I think also the SDGs, which, although I'm very sceptical myself, I think definitely provide an entry point for new actors and new organisations, and also for new funding, because that will dictate how a lot of the funding programmes work in the next couple of years. So there is a specific SDG around drug use. I think it's 3.5. And although it's more geared to possibly around advocacy around harm reduction, I think also that's something that we should be exploring. So I'll keep it brief, and I'll think on it. Maybe Steve will probably want to say a few words. So in conclusion, I think although, as Anne pointed out, the UNGAS was disappointing from many aspects, actually for us it was almost invigorating, and it's kind of the start of a new process for us, and hopefully we can keep building new coalitions and draw new child rights organisations towards working towards 2019, which will be our new milestone. And I hope some of these ideas will give an idea that it's possible to move the discussion away from Vienna, and if we can empower some of the Geneva-based mechanisms to address the issue more effectively, that could be really useful towards 2019 and could help us insert rights language as the cornerstone of a new framework around how we view drug policy. So I'll leave it at that, and yeah, maybe Steve can cheers.
Thank you to all our speakers. How long have we got for Q&A?
Like 15 minutes.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time for Q&A. If I might just say a couple of words. Something that Robin's mentioned is 2019. The UNGAS was a big moment. The last UNGAS on drugs was in 1998, so that was an 18-year gap. The next big kind of moment in terms of international UN high-level discourse on drugs is 2019. Is it General Assembly again?
It's
not
It's
UNGAS.
It's very unlikely to be an UNGAS.
Okay, so what 2019 is the moment when the UN's 10-year drug strategy from 1998, from 2009 comes to an end. It's 10 years. And is reviewed, and the new 10-year drug strategy is drawn up. So this is, in a way, I think the UNGAS has served as a kind of curtain raiser for the actual negotiations of the next 10-year drug strategy, which takes place in 2019. And I think even though the outcome document was, as Anne said, in many ways disappointing, and wasn't entirely disappointing. I think maybe you gave a rather slightly pessimistic. There is some useful language in there. It does reflect some progress. There is some useful human rights language. There is some references to alternatives to conviction and punishment. There is some stuff on proportionality and anti-sexual medicines. And it's worth reading a little bit more. It's not all bad. But certainly the discussions that took place that you saw in the video, those tensions and dynamics show that there is a lot still in play in the international debate. And it is possible that the pendulum will swing in a positive direction for 2019. And a couple of the other things that have come up from the speakers. One is, I think there's a useful point that Robin raised, is that the UNGAS provided a really useful focal point for civil society to come together and rally around in a common cause. And so, in fact, the civil society movement, there is a sort of status quo group of civil society organisations, but I'm speaking specifically about the reform group that is really represented by Iedc and some others, Anne's organisation, really found the UNGAS a sort of unifying focus of our attention, and I've never seen the reform movement work together so effectively and efficiently. So I was very inspired by that, and I think that's a very positive thing for moving forward. And another thing that Robin mentioned was, that's come up by all three speakers, is that the other UN agencies, one of the key useful things that came out of the UNGAS, I think, is that other UN agencies outside of the Vienna bubble, outside of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, were required to make submissions to the UNGAS process. So we had critical analysis of the war on drugs coming from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, from the UN Development Programme, from the World Health Organization, from UN Women, and from a whole range of other UN entities who haven't historically been involved in that discussion or debate at all. And some of those submissions and documents were remarkable pieces of work. The UNDP submission was a blistering critique of the failings of the war on drugs and did not hold back at all. It said the war on drugs has been a failure in terms of development, in terms of public health, in terms of human change, we need to decriminalise. I mean, bang, bang, bang. Some of this stuff is pretty hardcore. And the stuff from the UN human rights agencies, in some ways, was even more critical. So there was incredibly strong voices that haven't been heard in the debate from elsewhere in the UN were brought to the table. And hopefully, if that can somehow be formalised and continued as we move forward, then the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the very conservative drug agencies won't continue to operate in this sort of silo outside of the rest of the UN family and more established UN thinking. So there is actually, despite some of the disappointments of young gas, certainly from my perspective, there is also a great deal to feel positive about as we move forward towards 2019, which in terms of the high-level UN debate is the next critical moment. Now, of course, it's not all about the UN, and a lot of stuff can happen at a domestic level. And I think one of the conclusions that a lot of us came to is that we need to make sure and keep pushing reform at a domestic level as well as at the UN. Because in a way, a lot of the interesting things that happen at the UN are debates that are forced by reforms that are happening at domestic level. So the fact that, you know, all these US states, and the fact that Uruguay has legalized cannabis, and the fact that 25 countries have decriminalized all drugs, and the fact that 90 countries have harm reduction, you can't ignore that stuff when they're all in a big room talking about this. It forces the discussion, and especially when something like regulation is happening, which is outside of the legal structure that everyone in the room is operating within, you just can't ignore that. And they didn't ignore it. It didn't make it into the outcome document, but clearly those cracks are showing, and hopefully we can lever those cracks open a bit more as we move towards 2019, and try and build the group of reform countries so that they can operate as effectively as a group as the bad guys, as the villains of, you know, the Russias and the Chinas and the, I don't want to sound racist, but, you know, the status quo conservative groups. So having had my little rant, take any questions?
Yeah, it's not really a question, it's more reacting to what the panel has been addressing. And I was shocked at the end of the plenary not to find a single voice from the countries who called for the session. Not a single presence of a victim from Mexico or Colombia. In a context in which the casualties in Mexico and Central America have been identified by the IISS as concentrating 21% of the global war casualties, of the total aggregate of casualties in conflicts around the world, 21% are taking place in Mexico and Central America, and they are referring to these as high-intensity wars or conflicts. And in Colombia, we still have an internally displaced population of about 4 or 5 million people, mostly being displaced as a result of a war that was transformed by drug revenue and illicit, the impact of the illicit. So that's one question to those who were organizing civil society and doing all these. I find it fantastic, and I have called precisely for the human rights approach as a way forward. But I have two caveats, or two concerns, more than caveats, two concerns. One is the precedent that the agreement to disagree that was embodied in the outcome document, to interpret the conventions as countries see fit, is a very problematic precedent from a human rights perspective. I don't think that countries can be allowed to interpret torture as they see fit, or force disappearance as they see fit. So I find that problematic, even though I understand the way the UN works. I spent 3 years fully engaged with the UN on human rights and the responsibility to protect, working very closely with state members. And in terms of mobilizing human rights mechanisms, I think that is fantastic, but at the same time, very problematic, certainly for countries like Colombia and Mexico, where, again, the drug violence puts governments in an impossible position. Mexico is a country that opened up to human rights in a very rapid way, signed and ratified every single convention, every single treaty, and now as a result of the consequences of drug violence and a government that is basically unable to respond and to protect the population to that violence, it's turning its back to human rights. It's withdrawing. Mexico was one of the main founders of the Inter-American System of Human Rights that leads the way in terms of crimes against humanity, and it's just withdrawn the funding. So I think that there is a huge need for those who understand the complexities of drug policy to engage with human rights actors, so as to make them understand that they can just go and bash governments, as the Human Rights Commission in a way is doing in Mexico, without recognizing the way in which drug policy empowers criminal organizations and ends up putting against the wall governments and security forces. And one question on the children's, again, in the meetings I attended in New York, Save the Children was always present in terms of serious human rights violations. And are they in any way involved? I'm saying this because the representative in Mexico happens to be an ex-prominent ambassador, and she might, in a context in which in Mexico the forced recruitment of boys is happening as we are speaking.
Do you want to answer?
I'll try. I think with Save the Children, it's very difficult because they're so big. You know, they have a budget the size of many countries. I know from a child rights perspective, engaging in drug policy, we were always very marginalised. We had opponents going to our funders and saying these guys are trying to make children take drugs, and you know, we received serious pushback. And I think getting someone like Save the Children on board it's beyond our reach. It's beyond, you know, it's small incremental steps, and I think this is the first time we've been able to get a number of small child rights organisations on board for really the first time, and to get them to not talk about child protection, but that children are rights holders in themselves. And so there's a shift in the narrative and how we need to speak about it. And we've been banging this drum for 10 years and no one listened, but slowly it's starting to happen. I mean, with Save the Children, I wouldn't know how we would begin to engage.
Well, if I can help with it, I'm not a close friend or any way, but I can probably help lead the way to the Mexican ambassador who represents. She's in the board, I think.
Oh, that would be good.
Sorry. And on Save the Children, I was at a meeting at Bond Development Working Group where they came just to have a bit of a chat. So, there is some interest within Save, I think, to start talking more about drug policy. I'm not going to respond so much on the human rights questions and mechanisms because it's kind of outside my area of expertise. Although I was the civil society panelist at the first panel at the Human Rights Council on the world drug problem last September, and I think it was an important first step to just have a specific high-level panel on the issue of how drug control undermines the enjoyment of human rights. I was the only civil society speaker, unfortunately, under careful selection, which brings me to your first point that you made about how civil society speakers at the UNGAS itself. The speakers that you saw at the end of the plenary, just so you know, were only a fraction of the speakers from civil society that were selected to speak throughout the UNGAS process. So there were, in each of the roundtables, there were 2 civil society speakers as well as civil society speakers selected to speak at the stakeholder consultation that I mentioned under the auspices of the President of the General Assembly. I will say this though, it was a very fraught and difficult and highly politicised process to select speakers to speak. And I think it's probably the same in all areas at the UN. Because we had many speakers who applied to speak. But secondly, even though I was on the Civil Society Task Force and we were tasked with selecting speakers, civil society on drugs is very divided, as you can probably imagine. So my colleagues that I had to work with on the task force, we were probably divided about 65, 35, 65 of the representatives of the 26 in the task force, mostly from reform-minded organizations, and 35 who were from World Federation Against Drugs, Europe Against Drugs, you know, the temperance movement in Sweden, IOGT. You know, these guys are basically, they've accepted harm reduction, but they're not really accepting of removal of criminal sanctions. They basically still very much want to push for the idea of a drug-free world. So we had to negotiate with them when we were selecting speakers and come to a consensus, the irony, between us around who would speak. It was also really challenging to get people to the United States who had a criminal record. So that was the other problem with Latin America. You know, it was like, well, no, yeah. The ones who spoke from the most affected communities had a criminal record, either for using drugs, for growing drugs, for previously being incarcerated for a low-level drug offense, and trying to get them a visa to come speak at New York was not easy. So I'm just... Yeah, just to say that was partly the context, but there was a really, you know, in good faith we tried, and we did bring a farmer from Peru who spoke on the alternative development panel. Yeah, so it was, yeah, we tried.
Other questions, or are we running out of time?
I just want to point out to Monica that actually in the 98 case, there was a quote-unquote victim from the who was Regulera, Amaro Morales, who's now dead. But, you know, so it has happened, but it's not.
Okay, we do have a few more minutes. Does anyone have any questions up there?
I actually have two questions. One I think is for this panel, and the other one I just didn't know who was panel I should address it, so I just...
We'll have a go.
Perfect. The first one has to do precisely with what you were mentioning in terms of the different interests that not only among the states but also among the civil society organizations there are. And how to be strategic, I heard a lot about that in terms of what the priorities should be, and I think representing, maybe this question would be more for Anne, but for anyone over here, representing an association of different organizations, how is it that you can come to a document that you make sure that there's the like minimum denominator to make it effective in a way, because if you consider everyone's interest, there's at the end a great opportunity that loss of that is going to be lost at the negotiation process, especially when there is going to be a limited amount of issues that are going to come within all the states' interests. So if you could tell us a little bit about that, that would be really interesting, especially if you also consider that there are both like consumer countries, organizations, and somehow producer or victims associations, and there's so many different organizations, so many points of view in this debate. So that's one question, and the other question has more to do with what comes after the war on drugs, and I can see a lot on the consumer side, like on the two ends of the chain of consumption. So on the producer side, there's all these alternative models of development, including SDGs or just crop substitution, and other panels have talked about that. The Bolivian model was one that was put forth. And then also on the consumer end of it, there's a lot on decriminalization and also harm reduction strategies, especially in the presentation before that I think it was I'm sorry for the pronunciation. She gave lots of examples of those policies, but then the part in the middle, which is the one perhaps of the traffickers and the one that is to be blamed for most of the violence and for all of that has come wrong in the drug policies debate, I don't really see lots of differences, although sort of models that are being proposed and how to deal with the after the war on drugs, apart from the human rights approach.
Okay, two brilliant questions. I might have a crack at the latter one, but do you want to talk a bit about? Yeah, but are there any other questions? We can have a little question higher up.
I mean, to those who were in the UNGAS, how do you find the position of the US? I mean, because I think it's clearly very different from it has to be used before, you know, like a very strong position, and now you have a federal position and maybe the state's position shifting towards a more regulated market, especially in the case of marijuana. So how they can actually articulate a coherent argument when they have these two realities at the same time? Thank you.
Any other ones? Should we take those? Do you want to take any of those? Okay. I think it makes sense. Do you want to touch on the civil society stuff already?
Yeah. So if I understood your question correctly, you were saying that how do you incorporate this diverse range of views from civil society? Well, yes, it's a really good question because I lost a year and a half of my life to this process. So I mean, one thing is the IDPC consensus position amongst the network. So IDPC has policy principles. When you become a member, you've already agreed you're for reform. The challenging thing was in the civil society task force, collating views globally from global civil society and trying to collate those views into a meaningful set of recommendations. And it was challenging, I would say one thing that all civil society, and it was a red line for the civil society task force of all stripes and colours, was the death penalty, the abolition of the death penalty for drug offences. So we could all agree on that. We also basically found a way to all agree on the principle of harm reduction for people who use drugs. And then, but it was, and then you got into grey areas because some civil society representatives genuinely don't agree with the removal of criminal sanctions for people who use drugs, so decriminalisation. But that's a very small minority. And then you get to the thorny issues around legal regulation, of which some of them would feel very upset to be associated with that at all. So what we had to do in compiling these recommendations was to acknowledge that this was a majority view of those who were consulted, but that there were still some representatives who were consulted who didn't necessarily agree with all the views. To make sure that we actually set out at the beginning of this exercise for the UNGAS to say that we as civil society would not seek to find consensus, because we're always criticising the governments for doing that. So in our policy positions, we would acknowledge that there was a diverse range of views, and therefore we should not try to silence the views of some who genuinely felt they're not there, they're not ready to say, okay, we should legalise or we should legally regulate certain drugs in our society. So that's sort of how we dealt with it, to be more inclusive. But I think through the process, it's interesting because referring to my earlier point around how some people who were criminalised then couldn't get to speak. And this happened to some of the people they wanted, the other side, to come and speak. And I had this interesting exchange with this woman who I had a big fight with on decriminalisation. When her speaker didn't get to speak, the fight was around the decrim point, but then when her speaker didn't get to speak, I had a chat with her afterwards, and she was so upset. And she was like, yeah, it's ridiculous because he stopped using drugs like 15 years ago, and he has a criminal record, and then he just couldn't come here, and it's just, it's obscene, and he should have been able to come. And I was like, so what's the logical conclusion of what you're saying, And she was like, well, yes, maybe some people shouldn't get a criminal sanction. And I was like, yes, breakthrough. So it was also the process of all of us learning, I think, even those of us who were very staunchly, for reform, hearing the perspective of others, and trying to figure out how we're going to get them on board, basically.
Can I just address the US question very quickly? And Steve, please, you know more about this than me, so if I'm wrong, just tell me. But I have a real issue with their position. I mean, I think what they're saying is you can reinterpret the drug conventions as you wish, as fits to your national context. So that seems to be the position they're taking. And I think when you do that from a human rights perspective, you lose the normative value of the convention or a treaty. So another country can say, well, we reinterpret appropriate measures to mean we can lock up people who are needing drug treatment for an indefinite amount of time. So it gives the opportunity for other states who can interpret it in a way that you don't like, the opportunity to do so. And by the US taking that position, my fear is that other countries will take similar positions on other issues, which can be really dangerous from a rights perspective. So that's, for me, it seems to be quite a dangerous precedent that they're setting, and it could allow Singapore to say, well, we need to kill more drug traffickers because we see that as an appropriate, or whatever. So.
Yeah, I was just going to add one other thing to what Anne said, which is that as well as the bigger coalition of sort of reform groups and the coalition of more conservative groups, there was also a whole series of little sort of smaller groupings of civil society organisations based around particular thematic questions. So there was a group working on access to essential medicines. There was two of them here. There was the group of youth organisations working on youth issues. There were gender groups working on mainstreaming of gender access and treatment, and so on. So there were also, as well as the bigger groupings, and as well as organisations acting individually, there were also a whole series of. I mean, this is one of the complicated things about the UNGAS, because it wasn't like some of the other UNGASs. It wasn't like some of the previous UNGASs, where, I mean, like there was one about the arms, to get a small arms control treaty, and it was, it was like, we have to get 100 countries to sign this, and it was pretty black and white. At this UNGAS, there was at least sort of 7, 8, 9 major thematic areas. There was human rights, there was the death penalty, there was access to essential medicines, decriminalisation, incarceration, harm reduction. And each one of those has its own little ecosystem of civil society organisations beavering away on it. So that was all going on as well. Did you want to add anything? I'll just carry on. There was on the US. I mean, the US has been it was quite a remarkable story, I think, of what's happened in the US in the last few years. Is that, as I think Anne alluded to, they've moved from the position of the kind of drug warrior, sort of prohibitionist bullies of the world, and architects of the international drug control system, and kind of bulwark preserving it, to be a much softer line where they've been they've retreated from a lot of war on drugs language. They've been much more in favour of public health. They've been talking about human rights and proportionality and alternatives to incarceration. Now there's still a long way to go, but and in terms of the balance of their spending, from supply side stuff to treatment, it hasn't really changed very much. So there's a lot of rhetorical shift hasn't really been matched in terms of where the resources are going, and they're still doing a lot of the bad stuff. But at least the tone of their debate has changed. And certainly on things like decriminalisation and legalisation, they're not throwing their weight around the way they used to. Obviously because they're doing it themselves and they would be grossly hypocritical, so they can't. Certainly on cannabis. So the US is no longer seen as the kind of super bad guys of drug policy, and that mantle has kind of shifted much more to Russia, who are appalling throughout the entire preemptive process. Yes.
I happen to disagree with that.
I'm not defending US, I'm just saying it's changed in tone.
From the intervention at the session on development was really appalling. I can't remember exactly what the words were, but I was sitting next to Renata from the Social Science Research Council, who is Colombian, who has been doing research and work on these for years. And we both looked at each other like saying, how can they be saying this? It happens in UN debates. But the other thing that I think is very important to take into account, and that doesn't lead me to disregard the changes that are taking place in the US. But as I said in the first panel, there are very heavy bureaucratic interests that still benefit from these policies, that are leading, and there are two considerations here. One is that the US can afford to change the rhetoric because the Russians are doing now the ugly stuff, and the ugly rhetoric is being led by Russia. So they can afford because they are hiding behind them. And secondly, in terms, at least
to the impact of the U.S. stand on drugs in Latin America, the reality is that because there isn't a real stand and there isn't a real U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, including on drugs, the agencies drive the day, including the DEA. So in terms of Latin America, the perception is that the change is not that great.
I don't want to overstate it, but at least the rhetorical tone. And it's not just at the UNGAS, I mean, in a lot of forums, in Vienna, at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, they've been much more amenable to harm reduction and a whole series of things. There has been a noticeable change in the shift in tone.
But I would also say that I think I would agree with you that I think in the more public spaces they have shifted their tone, but I feel like they are getting others to do some of their dirty work for them, and that we know. But I think it's important in terms of the rhetoric, the rhetorical shift. I also wanted to come back briefly to your question about what about the people in the middle, you know, obviously yes, even for us we struggled with that question. So I mentioned one of the IPC asks was to no longer criminalise the most affected populations, and there we talked about people who use drugs, and we also talked about farmers, and we did also then try to bring in, to some extent, low-level non-violent offenders who are involved in the drug market for, you know, out of socio-economic necessity. But it was difficult to make that case. However, I think there's, you know, there is growing work around this issue. It's being led primarily, and I think it's also where the funding for it comes from, by the fact that the fastest growing prison population in most parts of the world is women, and women for low-level non-violent drug offences. So looking at that trend and then trying to understand why it is women, and what is it about women's socio-economic vulnerability that means that they are being caught up in the illicit drug market in this way, and then trying to go from there. And then the question that we've had pushed back from many other colleagues is, why are you able to hear women? You know, so now we you know, there is that push to kind of look at this area that has so far not been well addressed, to say, you know, why are these people being incarcerated, being caught up in this process? What are the consequences of that? And is that in any way achieving any of the objectives that we have around reducing the illicit drug trade? So it's a really good question, and I think, yeah, if you're interested, then do look at some of the work that's really around looking at the women issue in particular.
Okay, I think we're coming towards an end. Just a final thought on that question is that you're right, decriminalisation only deals with a part of the, it's very important, but it doesn't deal with the issues around trafficking and the trade. Only legalisation regulation ultimately can begin to address those problems. And yes, obviously it's not just about consumption, and we need to be thinking about where legalisation regulation would leave traditional producing regions as well. So it becomes a core part of the development discourse as well. And as the legalisation movement moves forward, it's something that Transform we've been very keen to, and IEDC and others have been very keen to encourage people not to ignore the development dimensions for traditional producers as we move towards that. And yes, and I can direct some literature on it. Thanks very much to all our speakers. I think we're done for the day. I'm sure someone else wants to say something.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, we are basically done today, so I would like to thank everyone who participated in this panel. Please. So, as you know, this was basically our first experience in this UCL Mexico Summit. We are very happy, very enthusiastic about this. I think it was an amazing topic, an amazing speaker, an amazing talk. We would like to invite you to continue this talk in one pub. It's basically the College Arms, which is basically in Store Street, very close to Good Street. The code is WC1E7EH. It's not very far from here actually.